A year ago, I was the kind of man who ate dinner standing up at the counter, because sitting down at an empty table felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Tonight, there are 2 plates on that table, 2 coffee mugs drying by the sink, and a woman asleep down the hall who once told me, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, that she'd been told she was too broken to be loved. This is how that changed. My name is Nolan Pierce. I'm 33, and I run a small dock and boat repair shop on the shore of Kestrel Lake, up in the northern part of Wisconsin, where the winters come early and the summer people mostly leave by Labor Day. I patch hulls, rebuild outboard motors, replace rotted dock boards, and keep half the marina running on borrowed parts and stubbornness. It's quiet work, the kind that lets a man's hands stay busy while the rest of him goes somewhere else entirely. I used to be engaged. Her name was Marisol, and she drowned in a boating accident on this same lake 6 years ago, on a calm evening that gave no warning it would take anything from anybody. I was the one who pulled her out. I was also the one who couldn't get to her fast enough, and I've spent every year since living with a version of that arithmetic that never quite balances. After that, I stopped fixing things that needed more than a wrench and a Saturday afternoon. I stopped letting myself want anything I couldn't lose safely. The cabin at the far end of the point had been empty for years before Wren Ashby moved into it that spring. I noticed the lights on before I ever noticed her, a single lamp glowing behind thin curtains most nights well past midnight, like whoever lived there had trouble sleeping and had given up trying. It was almost 3 weeks before I actually saw her, walking the gravel road at dusk with a slow, careful gait, one hand trailing along the split-rail fence like she needed something solid nearby at all times. I offered a wave the way you do with a new neighbor. She startled, more than the moment called for, then gave a small, tight nod before continuing on, and I understood in that half-second something I couldn't yet name, that whatever had brought her to Kestrel Lake, it wasn't the kind of thing you asked about on a first wave. It was nearly a month later that Vera at the general store mentioned, in the careless way small towns pass along things they shouldn't, that Wren had been in a car accident down in Madison 2 years back. Bad enough that she'd needed 3 surgeries. Bad enough that the scarring down her left arm and along her jaw hadn't faded the way scars are supposed to. Bad enough that her fiancé had left before the second surgery was even scheduled. Vera didn't know the details past that. I found out the rest of it the way you find out anything true in a small town. Slowly, and mostly from the person herself, once she trusted you enough to say it. That happened on an evening in early June, when Wren's ancient rowboat, the one relic left from whoever had owned the cabin before her, took on water 40 yards from shore, and started listing hard enough that she had to half swim, half drag it back to the dock, soaked through and shaking, more from fear than cold. I was out checking a mooring line nearby and got there in time to help her haul the boat up before it sank outright. "You're bleeding," I said, nodding at a shallow scrape along her forearm where the boat's cracked hull had caught her. She looked down at it like it belonged to someone else. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It's bleeding," I said. And before she could argue further, I'd already retrieved the first aid kit I kept in the shop, the same one I'd used on 100 fishing hooks and splinters over the years. She sat on the edge of the dock while I cleaned the scrape, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like she was holding something very still inside herself. "You don't have to do this," she said, finally. "I know," I said. "I'm doing it anyway." She let out something that was almost a laugh, though it didn't quite reach all the way there. "That's an unusual policy. Around here it's called being a decent neighbor," I said. "You've been in that cabin 2 months, and I don't think I've said more than 10 words to you." "I'm not much for conversation lately," she admitted, and something in the careful way she said it told me not to push. I didn't. I just finished wrapping the scrape, handed her a dry towel from the shop, and told her the rowboat's transom was rotted clean through and not worth patching, that I had an old aluminum John boat sitting unused behind my shop she was welcome to borrow instead. She hesitated, the way people do when they've learned that accepting help costs something they'd rather not pay, and then she said thank you, quiet and genuine, and walked back up the gravel road toward the cabin with the towel still wrapped around her arm. I didn't expect to think about her as much as I did over the following days, but something about the careful, guarded way she moved through the world, like she was bracing for an impact only she could see coming, stayed with me longer than I meant to let it. The John boat became the beginning of something, though neither of us called it that at the time. She returned it 2 days later with a jar of blackberry jam she'd made, apparently, from the wild brambles along the fence line, setting it on my workbench with the kind of awkward formality of someone unused to giving gifts. I invited her to stay for coffee, mostly to see if she would, and she did, sitting stiffly on the overturned bucket I kept for customers while I worked, watching me rebuild a carburetor with more attention than the task probably warranted. "You're good at that," she said after a while. 20 years of practice," I said. "You get good at anything eventually, if you do it enough times." "I used to believe that," she said, and something in her voice went distant, and I didn't ask what had changed her mind, though I suspected, even then, it had something to do with whatever had put those scars on her arm and that guarded set to her shoulders. Over the following weeks, a rhythm built itself between us without either of us designing it. She started walking down to the dock most evenings, sometimes with a book she never seemed to actually read, sometimes with nothing but her own restless energy. I started leaving the shop door propped open a little later than I used to. We talked about small things mostly, the lake's moods, the marina's gossip, a heron that had taken up residence near her dock and regarded both of us with open disdain. She never mentioned Madison. I never mentioned Marisol. We were, I think, two people circling the edges of our own wreckage, testing whether the other person might be safe enough to eventually walk closer. It was on a warm evening in July, fixing a loose hinge on her cabin's screen door, because she'd mentioned in passing that it had been sticking for weeks, that I noticed the way she instinctively angled her left side away from me whenever I got close, tucking the scarred arm behind her back like it was something shameful, rather than simply something that had happened to her. "You don't have to hide it," I said, quietly, not looking up from the hinge. "Whatever it is." She went very still. "Hide what?" "Your arm," I said. "I've noticed you keep it turned away. You don't have to, not around me." For a long moment she didn't say anything, and I thought I'd overstepped badly enough to end whatever fragile thing had been building between us. Then, slowly, she brought her arm forward, letting the long scar catch the evening light, pale and raised, running from her wrist nearly to her elbow alongside two smaller ones near her jaw that I'd noticed but never mentioned. "Car accident," she said. 2 years ago. A truck ran a light and I spent 4 months in and out of surgery just to keep the arm working at all." She paused, her voice thinning. "My fiancé left before the second surgery. He told his mother, who told my sister, who eventually told me, that he didn't think he could spend a lifetime with someone this broken. She said the word like it had been handed to her so many times it had started to feel like her own. I set the screwdriver down. Whoever told you that was wrong in a way that says a great deal more about them than it does about you?" "You don't know that," she said, though her voice wavered. "I know a scar isn't the same thing as being broken," I said. "I know the woman who dragged a sinking rowboat back to shore alone rather than call for help isn't somebody's idea of fragile. And I know whoever left you over stitches and surgery scars wasn't leaving because you were too broken. He was leaving because he was too shallow to stay." She looked at me for a long moment, something unguarded and searching in her eyes. And then she looked away, out toward the lake, blinking hard. "I don't know why I told you that." "I'm glad you did," I said, and meant it more than I let show. The days after that carried a different kind of closeness, tentative but real. She started leaving the curtains open a little more. I started finding reasons to walk the gravel road past her cabin, even when the shop didn't need anything from that direction. One overcast afternoon, she showed up at the shop with a toolbox that looked like it had never once been opened, asking, with obvious embarrassment, whether I might teach her how to use half of what was in it. "I've been living alone in that cabin for 4 months, she admitted, setting the box down on my workbench like it might bite her. "Every time something breaks, I either ignore it or drive 40 minutes to pay someone else to fix it. I'd like to stop being afraid of a screwdriver." I spent that whole afternoon showing her the basics: how to hold a drill so the torque didn't wrench her wrist, how to tell a Phillips head from a flathead without squinting, how to sand down a rough edge instead of just papering over it with tape. She was clumsy at first, overcorrecting for the stiffness that still lived in her left arm since the accident. She didn't quit, even when she stripped a screw badly enough that I had to show her how to back it out with a rubber band and patience. "You're better at this than you're giving yourself credit for," I told her, watching her drive a screw clean and true on her third attempt. "Don't get used to complimenting me," she said, though she was smiling. "I might start expecting it. I could live with that," I said. And she looked over at me for a moment, something warm and startled crossing her face, before she went back to the screw like she needed somewhere else to put her attention. She started coming by most afternoons after that, ostensibly to keep practicing, though we both understood it had stopped being only about the toolbox somewhere in that first week. I taught her to patch a hairline crack in her cabin's porch railing. She taught me, in turn, that she made a genuinely excellent cup of coffee, strong enough to strip paint, and that she hummed old jazz standards under her breath when she was concentrating hard on something, unconscious and unself-conscious in a way that made something in my chest ache pleasantly every time I noticed it. It was during that stretch that her older sister, Dell, called one afternoon while Wren was in the shop, and I caught enough of the conversation through the thin walls to understand the shape of it even without hearing every word. Dell meant well, from what I could tell, but her worry came out sounding like doubt, asking Wren whether she'd really thought through starting something new so soon, whether she was ready, whether isolating herself out at a lake with a near stranger was really the healthiest way to recover from everything Preston had put her through. Wren came back into the shop afterward looking smaller than she had all week, arms wrapped around herself in the old guarded way I hadn't seen from her in some time. "She's not wrong to worry," Wren said, before I could ask. "I did move out here somewhat suddenly. I don't blame her for wondering if I'm running from something instead of actually healing." "Are you?" I asked, gently. "Running, I mean." She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think I moved out here because Madison had turned into a place that only reminded me of everything I'd lost. But I don't think I came here looking for you specifically. I think I came here looking for quiet, and you happen to be part of the quiet that turned out to matter." "That's a fairer answer than most people give their own sisters," I said. She smiled, small and tired. "Dell just wants to make sure nobody hurts me again. I understand why. I spent a long time not protecting myself well enough." And she watched all of it happen. She paused. "I told her you were the first person since the accident who's never once made me feel like my scars were a subject to be managed around." She didn't really know what to say to that. "Good," I said. Let her sit with not knowing what to say. "It means she's actually listening." Wren laughed, real and warm, and something in her posture eased back open, and I understood, watching her, that whatever ground we were building between us was sturdier than either of us had let ourselves believe just yet. One evening, mending a fishing net on her porch while she read beside me, actually reading, this time, not just holding the book like a shield, she asked, without looking up, whether I'd ever been in love. I told her about Marisol. I told her about pulling her from the water too late, about the years since spent keeping my hands busy so the rest of me didn't have room to feel the shape of what was missing. Wren listened without trying to fix any of it, which I was coming to understand was rare and precious, in a way I hadn't fully appreciated until she offered it to me. "You don't seem broken to me either," she said, quietly, when I'd finished. "Just careful. There's a difference." "Maybe we're both just careful then," I said, and she smiled, small and real, and something in the space between us shifted another quiet inch closer. It was near the end of July when Preston Cade came back into her life, pulling his car up the gravel road on a Thursday afternoon like he had every right to be there. I was working in the shop and heard the engine before I saw him, and something in my chest went tight the moment I recognized the careful, expensive way he was dressed for a lake town. The kind of man who visits but never actually lives anywhere real. Wren went pale when she opened her door and found him standing there. "Preston, what are you doing here?" "I've been trying to reach you for weeks," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone used to being forgiven easily. "Your sister told me where you'd gone. I wanted to see you in person." "There's nothing left to say," Wren said, though her voice had gone thin and uncertain in a way that worried me more than his presence did. "I've had time to think," Preston said. "I panicked, back then. The surgeries, the uncertainty. I wasn't ready for it, and I handled it badly. I know that. But I've missed you, Wren. I think we rushed apart without really talking it through. I stayed back near the shop, close enough to hear, far enough to let her handle it on her own terms. I saw her hands trembling at her sides, saw the old familiar posture of someone bracing for another verdict about her own worth. You told your mother I was too broken to build a life with? Wren said, her voice cracking slightly. That's not panic, Preston. That's a decision. People say things they regret when they're scared, he said. I'm asking for a second chance. I think if we're honest, neither of us has really moved on. I felt something tighten low in my chest at that. A fear I hadn't let myself name directly until that moment. That whatever had been building slowly between Wren and me over the past 6 weeks might not be enough to outweigh whatever history still tied her to a man who'd once known her whole life before the accident rearranged it. Wren didn't answer him right away. She looked past him, toward the lake, toward the dock where the borrowed John boat sat tied, and I watched something conflicted move across her face before she finally spoke. I need time to think, she said. Please leave, Preston. He hesitated, glanced once in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read, then nodded slowly and returned to his car, though not before saying, just loud enough for both of us to hear, I'll be at the lodge in town through the weekend, if you change your mind. After his car disappeared down the gravel road, Wren stood very still on her porch for a long moment before finally sinking down onto the top step, her hands pressed against her face. I crossed the distance between us and sat down beside her, close but not touching, giving her room to reach for me if she wanted to. You don't owe him an answer just because he showed up asking for one, I said. He looked so certain, she said, lowering her hands from her face. Like he genuinely believed showing up here and saying the right words would just erase everything that happened. Like the last 2 years were a misunderstanding instead of a decision he made. Some people mistake persistence for love, I said. It isn't. Love doesn't usually need to be talked back into existence after it already walked out the door once. She looked at me, something raw and uncertain in her expression. What if I'm only hesitating because some part of me still wants him to have been wrong about me? What if choosing to consider him at all just means I still need his approval to feel like I'm worth something? Then that's worth sitting with, honestly, I said. I can't answer that for you. But I don't think you need his approval anymore, Wren. Not from where I'm sitting. I think you've spent months proving to yourself, one small repaired hinge and one borrowed boat at a time, that you don't need anyone's verdict to know your own worth. I think Preston showing up now is just the last test of whether you actually believe that yet. I know, she said, muffled behind her hands. But hearing him say he's missed me, it made me remember how badly I wanted someone to say that, back when I was in that hospital bed wondering if I'd ever feel like myself again. And now here he is saying it, and I don't know if I'm considering it because I actually want him back, or because some old, wounded part of me still wants proof that I was worth staying for. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the old fear tighten further in my chest, before I made myself say the honest thing instead of the comfortable one. I can't tell you which of those it is, I said. That's something only you can sort out. But I don't think you need Preston's second thoughts to prove your worth to yourself. I think you already know it, somewhere under all that old noise, even if it's been a long time since you let yourself believe it. She looked over at me, eyes bright with unshed tears, and didn't answer. And I didn't push her to. Some things need their own time to settle. And I understood, sitting there beside her in the fading evening light, that this was one of them. She didn't come down to the dock the next 2 evenings. I told myself that was fair, that a decision like this deserved space rather than pressure, even as some old, careful part of me quietly braced for the possibility that she might choose the familiar wound over the newer, more uncertain hope. I kept myself busy with a backlog of motor repairs I didn't actually need to finish that week, the way I'd once kept myself busy after Marisol, using work as a wall against the parts of myself that didn't know what else to do with waiting. On the second night, unable to sleep, I walked down to the end of the dock and sat with my feet hanging over the black water, listening to the loons calling somewhere out on the lake, and let myself think, for the first time in 6 years. about what it would actually mean to lose someone I'd let myself care about again. I thought about Marisol, about the particular, permanent shape of that kind of loss. I thought about the careful, guarded way Wren had started to soften around me over the past 6 weeks, and how much it would cost both of us if that softening turned out to be temporary, a stop on her way back to someone more familiar. I didn't come to any tidy conclusion out there in the dark. I only came to understand, watching the moon break apart and reassemble itself on the water, that I wanted her to choose whatever made her whole, even if that meant it wasn't me, and that wanting that for her mattered more than protecting myself from the disappointment of it. It was the first time in 6 years I'd let myself want something that badly, knowingly, without immediately building a wall around the wanting. On the third evening, restocking shelves in the shop long after I should have closed, I heard her footsteps on the gravel outside, slower and more hesitant than usual. "I went to see him," she said, standing in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, at the lodge. "Yesterday, something in my chest went very still. And I realized about 10 minutes into the conversation that I wasn't actually considering going back to him," she said. "I was considering whether the version of myself that existed before the accident, the one he fell in love with, the one without scars, was a version I still needed to prove I could be. And I don't think I do anymore. I don't think I want to be that version again. I think I want to be whoever I've become since, scars and all, and I don't think Preston has any interest in that person." "What did you tell him?" I asked, though something in her expression had already answered it. "That he was right about one thing," she said. "That we'd both changed since Madison, just not in the direction he was hoping for." She paused, drawing a slow breath. "He called me broken again. On the way out. Not directly, but close enough. Said he hoped I'd find someone who could handle, his word, someone in my condition." I felt something harden in my chest, quiet and resolute rather than sharp with anger. "He's wrong," I said, "and I think some small, exhausted part of you still wonders if he isn't, and I understand why, given how many people have told you some version of the same lie. But I don't believe it for a second, Wren. Not about the woman who dragged a sinking boat back to shore by herself, rather than ask for help she didn't think she deserved." She looked at me for a long moment, something fragile and searching in her expression, and then, so quietly I almost missed it under the sound of the lake lapping against the dock outside, she said, "They said I'm too broken to love." I set down the wrench still in my hand and crossed the small distance of the shop until I was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her face up to meet my eyes. "Then let me be broken with you," I said. She went very still, searching my face like she was checking whether I'd meant it as comfort or as something realer and harder to take back. "Nolan, I'm not offering to fix you," I said, before she could talk herself out of hearing it plainly. "I don't think you need fixing. I'm telling you I've spent 6 years keeping every part of myself that might get hurt, locked away behind a workbench in a lake that took someone I loved. I'm not whole either, Wren. I don't think anybody who's actually lived long enough to love somebody stays whole. But I'd rather be broken next to you than careful and empty on my own. If that's something you'd consider." Her eyes filled, and this time she didn't try to hide it, didn't turn her scarred arm away from me the way she had that first evening on her porch. She stepped forward instead, closing the last of the distance between us, and rested her forehead against my chest, right where my heart was beating hard enough that I was certain she could feel it. "I don't know how to do this without being afraid," she whispered. "Neither do I admitted. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe without you." She laughed, a small, wet, unsteady sound, and looked up at me. "That's either the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, or the saddest." "Maybe both," I said, and she smiled. And I finally closed the last inch between us and kissed her, carefully at first, giving her every chance to step back, and then with more certainty when she didn't, her good hand coming up to rest against my jaw like she was testing whether this, too, was allowed to be real. The weeks after that settled into something neither of us rushed. She started leaving her curtains fully open in the evenings, the lamp glowing steady rather than lonely. I started keeping a second coffee mug on the shelf without needing to be asked. We were careful with each other in the particular way of two people who understood exactly how much the other one had already lost, and precisely how much courage it took to risk losing something again. She moved a small box of her things into the shop's back room that August, not because either of us had decided anything formal, but because it stopped making sense for her to walk the gravel road home each night when the evenings had started running long and easy between us. I noticed, the first morning she stayed, that she'd set 2 mugs out by the coffee pot before I'd even woken up. And something in that small, ordinary gesture undid me more than any grand declaration could have. "You don't have to do that," I told her, nodding at the mugs. "I know," she said, echoing the words I'd used the first evening I patched the scrape on her arm. "I'm doing it anyway." I laughed, recognizing herself handing my own words back to me, and something in the moment settled deep and warm in my chest. We spent that autumn learning the small, unglamorous logistics of 2 lives folding into one, whose coffee order was whose, which side of the bed she preferred, the fact that she still occasionally woke from nightmares about the accident and needed, on those nights, simply to be held, rather than talked through it. I learned to recognize the difference between her quiet moods that wanted company and the ones that wanted space, and she learned, in turn, the particular days each year when the lake's stillness made my grief for Marisol rise back up sharper than usual, and how to sit with me through those without trying to talk me out of missing her. One October evening, hauling the last of the season's boats out of the water before the lake began to freeze, Wren stood beside me on the dock and asked, out of nowhere, whether I thought scars ever really finished healing. "I don't think they finish," I said after a moment. "I think they just stop being the only thing you can see when you look at yourself." She considered that, watching the last boat settle onto its trailer. "I think I believe that now," she said. "I don't think I did, back in Madison. I think I needed someone to keep looking at me the same way through all of it before I could believe the scars weren't the whole story." "They were never the whole story," I said. "Not to me, and not to anyone worth keeping around." She smiled, and reached for my hand, and we stood there together on the emptying dock, as the first hard frost of the season settled quietly over the lake. One evening in September, mending the same fishing net from that porch afternoon months before, Wren reached over and traced the scar along her forearm without hiding it, without angling it away. "I used to think this was the ugliest thing about me," she said. "The thing that finally proved I wasn't worth staying for. And now?" I asked. "Now I think it's just proof I survived something that could have taken a lot more than it did," she said. "I think I needed someone to see it and not flinch before I could believe that myself." "I've never once flinched," I said. "Not from the first evening you kept it turned away from me." She smiled, and reached for my hand instead, lacing her fingers through mine, scar and all, out in the open where the whole lake could see it if it cared to look. We were married the following spring, on the dock where the sinking rowboat had first brought us together, with Vera from the general store crying through the whole short ceremony, and the heron watching from its usual disdainful distance like it had known all along this was coming. Dell came up from Madison for it, and pulled me aside beforehand with the same careful scrutiny she'd apparently given the whole situation over the phone months earlier. "I was worried when she first told me about you," Dell admitted. "I'd watched her get hurt badly enough that I didn't trust anyone showing up quickly afterward with kind words and a quiet lake house." "I understand why," I said. "I do too now," she said, glancing toward Wren, who stood at the far end of the dock adjusting her sister's borrowed pearl earrings with a steadiness in her hands I hadn't seen from her back in July. "She writes to me now about a toolbox, and a heron and a man who never once flinched at her arm. That's not the sister I said goodbye to at the hospital 2 years ago. Whatever you did out here, thank you for it." "I didn't do anything except stay," I told her. Honestly, she did the rest herself. Wren wore a simple pale dress, her arm bare and unhidden in the morning light, and when she walked toward me across those weathered boards, I thought about the woman who'd once startled at a neighbor's wave, who'd learned to angle her wounds away from the world because the world had taught her they weren't welcome. Standing there with her hand finally in mine, I understood something I hadn't let myself believe in the 6 long years since the lake first took someone from me. That love was never actually about finding someone whole enough to complete you. It was about finding someone brave enough to stay broken alongside you, and choosing, every ordinary day after, to stay broken together instead of carefully, safely, alone.